السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين. اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على المبعوث رحمة للعالمين سيدنا وحبيبنا وقرة أعيننا قائد الغر المحجلين وشفيع المذنبين وصاحب اللواء المحمود والحوض المورود سيدنا محمد بن عبد الله وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن اهتدى بهديه واستنى بسنته إلى يوم الدين. تركنا المحجة البيضاء ليلها كنهارها لا يزيغ عنها إلا هالك وبعد. So thank you, Sidi Ayub, for helping us commence this third session of Beautiful Islam. And in the past two sessions, we touched up what we thought were some points of context that would be important for where we're going with this. And we had mentioned, I think, a little bit about some of the difficulties in practicing Islam today, that many of our spaces, as it were, have become fraught with difficulties stemming from different interpretations of Islam, and sometimes even to the level of polemics and sectarianism. There seems to be sometimes a gap between our ability to take the pristine teachings of the Prophet ﷺ and then apply them for our own purposes and our own context. The dearth of qualified teachers doesn't help that either. And the rigors of our life that are driven by different factors, though technologically driven, but we find ourselves kind of losing a little bit of our ability to be basically human, I think, in many of these instances. But we know the promise of Islam is true, and we know that Islam يصلح لكل زمان ومكان, that Islam can rectify the last of the Ummah just as it can rectify the first of the Ummah. And so these principles are timeless, yet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also asks us to exert ijtihad. In other words, we have to do a little bit of work in order to see and to apply these principles and how they relate to our specific circumstances. And this ijtihad, or this exertion of effort, will not be without facing challenges. Our predecessors faced challenges, perhaps different sorts of challenges, but nonetheless they did face challenges. And we too will face different types of challenges. So this life was not meant to be a cakewalk or something just quite easy that we can stroll through without any pain, without any suffering, without any difficulties, but rather these things that we do find us in our lives of difficulty and suffering and pain, both physical and emotional, perhaps even spiritual, is all part of the design, the divine plan behind this hayat dunya. Right? And it was not called dunya except min ad-dunu. It was not called dunya, meaning it's the lowest form of existence. And we were created for the higher form of existence, the life of the afterlife. But we are put here as a means and as a test so that we can make it to that afterlife. And so if we feel uneasy, if we feel out of place, if we feel that like a stranger in this life, then those are actually signs of iman. They're signs of belief. To the degree that the Prophet ﷺ even told us, كن في الدنيا كغريب أو عابر سبيل, أو كما قال صلى الله عليه وسلم, be in this world like a stranger or someone just passing through. And ideally, we see this passing through as an opportunity. We see this passing through as a gift from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and one that was given to us specifically. Each single one of us could have been given to somebody else, but it was given to us specifically. And so one of the most important motivators then and drivers for us to make it through, inshallah, successfully in this life was to show our gratitude towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And He accords us many opportunities by which we can do just that. So He did not leave us to our own devices. He did not leave us to try to figure things on our own, but He revealed His words to us. And He revealed His words to us via people who are like us, but at the same time, not like us. So people who resemble us in form, but in meaning and in their abilities to convey the divine meanings and the divine words and to hold themselves to task for those divine commands and prohibitions, they're not like us. And of course, I'm talking about the messengers and the prophets. And of course, the greatest of them all, Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, his name means praise. His name means the one who is the most praised. And so, our deen really centers around praise and gratitude and mahabba and love and mercy. These are the main themes of the teachings. And they do not center around anger and intiqam and revenge. And even our concept of justice is important, but it is measured as compared to divine justice. Divine justice is exacting. It never fails. It is precise. It will always hit its mark. But human justice, or justice that is sought by humans, is none of those things. It will always be relative. It will always be flawed. It will always be missing the mark somehow. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't ask us to seek or to try to enact divine justice. He has left that task for Him. But what He has asked us to do is to try to embody as much of the divine mercy as much as possible, of His rahmah. Right? Even the manner by which we invoke His name, when we say Bismillahi, in the name of Allah, Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim. We don't say Bismillahi Al-Jabbar, Al-Qahhar. We don't say Bismillahi Al-Muntaqim, Al-Mutakabbir. And these are also divine names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But that which we usually start any act that is of any merit, of any worth, as is mentioned in the hadith, we begin it by Bismillahi Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim. So this is central, I believe, and essential. Central and essential to really practicing Islam. And we called it beautiful Islam, but to me it's not almost, it is redundant. Islam is beautiful, we don't have to call it beautiful. But due to our circumstances and due to, I think, the misconceptions and misinterpretations and sometimes misconstruing of the beautiful aspects of the deen and turning them to something else, then it became, I think, necessary and incumbent to at least try to point these things out. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent the messengers, and He made them people like us, and He sent them to not only be messengers and carriers of that divine message, so not just carrying it to us, but actually showing us how to implement it, showing us how to live it, showing us how to be the best version of ourselves. And in that scripture, specifically the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has shown us how to go about discerning the reality around us. And the ultimate reality being that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala هو الواحد هو الأحد هو الموجود بل هو الواجب بالوجود. The ultimate reality being that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is one, and He is existent, and that He is necessary, and not just existing, but His existence is necessary. There would be none of this. There would be no kawn without al-mukawwin. There would be no khalq without al-khaliq. There would be no surah without al-musawwir. Right? So there'd be no forms without the one who made the forms. There would be no creation without the creator. And there would be no kawn. There would be no existence or being of any kind except for the one who puts things into existence, al-mukawwin, namely Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so if all those things are true, and we understand that, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also has given us certain tools by which we can discern that, certain tools by which we can go about understanding that. So, if we look at let's call it the crisis of knowledge that we have today, in the era of what some are calling post-truth and false news and relativism and nihilism and all of these things that the Academy talks about, that seem to be ever increasing. I think the main issue is discerning truth from falsehood. So determining what this person is saying or what this particular group of people or institution or what have you, what is they're saying, is it true? Can we put any trust in it or can we not trust it? And the second theme would be discerning the real from the distorted and manipulated. Are what we're seeing is real or is it not real? Is it imagined? Can it only be real if we have physical access to it, or can we discern its reality by other means? And these are kind of the big questions that we struggle with. We were talking about discerning reality and the crisis of knowledge today affecting believers and non-believers alike, namely discerning truth from falsehood, knowing what to believe and what not to believe, especially from whether a source is trusted or is to be trusted or not to be trusted, or should I trust my instincts, or should I trust whatever particular I derive with my intellect, or should that not be trusted? I think people have issues with that. And also discerning the real from the distorted and or manipulated. So also not just the truth of things, but the reality of things to that level. And we had mentioned that people have all sorts of words to describe the crisis, as it were, that we're facing today with relativism and post-truth and fake news and now this thing called deep fakes and how is one to contend in the midst of all of that. And I think these are issues that are important to think about. And we have the tools as believers and as followers of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He has given us those tools, and he took great pains sallallahu alaihi wasallam to even point out the distortions that would come later. And he said that the ma'ruf would become munkar and the munkar would become ma'ruf, or in the eyes of people, that people will see that which is good, that which is pure, as the opposite, as munkar, as contemptible, and they'll see the contemptible as something that is pure and something that is good. And in a sense, I believe the Prophet ﷺ was telling the companions at the time, who really probably did not have a frame of reference for understanding how that can even be possible. And then on more than one occasion they asked him, like when he said that we would be like, we would be affected by al-wahan, right, by great weakness. And the companions asked him, are we going to be a small number? How is that going to be possible? We're going to be weak and we're going to be like the dinner table, and there will be different parties and others coming for us. They couldn't imagine that. So he said, no, we're not going to be a small number. We're going to be like Walead is-Sayl. We're going to be like the waves that crash along the beachhead, and then the suds that are left afterwards, after the wave retreats. So that type of weakness. And that's very important. We often talk about the Hadith Jibreel and the three aspects of Islam that are mentioned in it, namely Islam, Iman, and Ihsan. But there's actually four aspects. Iman, Islam, Ihsan, wa alamat as-sa'a, ashrat as-sa'a, the signs of the hour. And this was so important that Jibreel alayhi salam asked the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he even asked him, Mata as-sa'a? He said, Ma al-mas'ul a'lam min as-sa'il. I don't know any more than you do about when it's going to be. Then he said, Akhbirni an amaratiha. Tell me about the signs of it. And then he went on and gave a few of the signs, and talad al-amatu rabbataha, and then you find the barefoot, destitute, naked Bedouins building tall buildings and so forth. So all of that indicates that this was an important aspect of the deen. It remains an important aspect of the deen, because people then might tend to question the reality and might tend to question the truthness of the deen of Islam, because we're under the assumption that if we do all these things right, if we practice the deen faithfully, then these things should line up. But nevertheless, the Prophet ﷺ informs us, no, not necessarily so. So then one is left to say, well, what is going to line up then? What is going to feel right? And we look to the other hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, one of the others anyway, and he said لا تزال طائفة من أمتي ظاهرين على الحق لا يضرهم ولا يضر من يخذلهم. أو كما قال صلى الله عليه وسلم. There will be a group of the believers ظاهرين على الحق. They will be upholding the haqq. In other words, haqq could mean the real and the true. So they'll know what's real and they will know what's true, and they will not be harmed by those who don't. They will not be harmed by those who don't. And this is similar to the verse in the Quran, يا أيها الذين آمنوا عليكم أنفسكم لا يضركم من ضل إذا اهتديتم. إذا اهتديتم. يا أيها الذين آمنوا, O who believe, لا يضركم من ضل. You will not be harmed by those who go astray. إذا اهتديتم. If you are upon guidance. If you are upon guidance. So I think this is extremely, extremely important and critical for us to be aware of that. It's critical for us to teach that to our children. We cannot just, I think, hand our children some sort of utopia that we think how things are going to turn out. They should be critically aware of the failings and the shortcomings of the modern world and all that means, and definitely of our culture and the pressures that we find ourselves, specifically, in the realm of education, whether it be public education or university education, and many of the themes now that are being emphasized that clearly pose some difficulty and challenges to us as Muslims and as believers. These are important things, and these are things we have to teach our children. And at the same time, not to be spiteful, not to be angry, not to be resentful, but rather to uphold these teachings to the best of our ability, to remain compassionate, to remain merciful, not to judge people for what they're upon, but to think about their guidance and to think about how we can help them come to that guidance. And if we emphasize these themes in our gatherings, within ourselves, with our children, in our education systems, then I think the beauty of Islam as it is and as it always was will definitely shine through, insha'Allah. So the question then remains the gap, right? And when we name these set of sessions, bridging the gap between religious practice and spirituality. And we live in a time now where many people are hesitant or even loath to think about religious practice or piety or traditional religion or being beholden to a set of standards that will be used as criteria to measure themselves up in terms of how they're doing with their Lord and how they're doing in life. People want to be free what they think are of these shackles. And part of the problem here is the elevation of the individual to the level where then the individual then becomes the one to be most qualified in their eyes, in the individual's eyes, to discern all of these things. And so what you find, and I think I read an article the other day, I read it somewhere, that in the West, for example, there is this sort of buffet-style approach to spirituality. And so you'll find people taking certain elements or aspects of Buddhism, or taking certain aspects of Taoism, or even taking certain aspects of Islam. And sometimes people even go to the degree that they'll call themselves an aspect of Islam, but won't call themselves Muslim. So we had the phenomena of people calling themselves Sufis and somehow loving Sufism and so forth, but at the same time not really identifying with Islam. And you have also the phenomenon today of people reading Rumi, Jalaluddin Maulana, and becoming versed in it and reading translations of it by people who don't even know the original Persian, and then somehow the message gets lost that this man was not just a poet and said pithy things and was a great poet, but he was a arif billah, right? He was someone who embodied and was a Muhammadan heir. He was an heir of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He was a knower of God. He was agnostic. He was able to embody these eternal truths, and then he was able then to disseminate them and to talk about them in a way that was quite appealing to everybody. So people got that appealing part, but they didn't see all the work, right? They didn't see kind of the foundation underneath. That wasn't discernible to them. And even if you just take a kind of a casual visit to his maqam and his what was his zawiyah in Konya, you see that there was a lot of work that went into this. You know, those small rooms that they have around the saha, around the outdoor courtyard area, which are now have been turned into like little museum exhibits of his sibha and his book and things like this. But actually, those were rooms of spiritual rigor. People would go in there and they would make a dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and they'd spend days at a time, or perhaps even more, maybe weeks. And you know, they had, at the end of the courtyard, you saw the huge kitchen area, and it was said that people would spend at least a year, 300 days in the kitchen before they would even think about letting them do something else. Right? They were taught to serve. They were taught to slay their egos, right? Slay their desire to be praised, and slay their desires to be known, and slay their desires to be a somebody and accolades and all this in the eyes of people by working in the kitchen, by serving people. And then if they were able to serve faithfully in that place, in the kitchen, then they could move on, and then they can do other things. Then perhaps they would be participants in some of the majalis, some of the gatherings that would be held in the zawiyah or in the mosque itself, and so on. So it was a whole program behind it. It wasn't some sort of, you know, individual quest for success. Right? We're trained in the West, in this culture, you know, everybody's kind of the hero of their own story. Everybody's a superhero in their particular narrative, right? And they have their own origin story, and then at the end of the day, they're going to wind up in some sort of whatever they think superhero that they're going to be in their particular story. But really how it's been done for centuries, if not millennia, is that there have been institutions, there have been programs, there's inherited wisdom. Right? There's inherited traditions. There are people who embody these traditions. There are people who carry it. There are people who dedicate their whole lives, day and night, relentlessly, to acquiring this knowledge, to embodying this knowledge, and then trying to disseminate this knowledge in the best way possible for their generation and the generations after, and preserving this knowledge. So I don't know of any shortcuts. I don't know of any easy access off-ramps that one can take to find themselves in kind of, I think, this thing that we're looking for, but it takes some effort. It takes some hard work. It takes that you want to dedicate a part of your everyday to it. It means you study. It means you take notes. It means you review your notes. It means that you avail yourself of any opportunity by which you may be able to learn something. It also means that you may have to sacrifice something of your free time, something maybe of a hobby, or even something that may be not that important, but it takes mujahada, right? It takes putting effort and resisting the temptations of the lower soul or the ego. So all of these things are there, and they're still preserved, and they haven't gone anywhere. And you know, alhamdulillah, that despite all of the things we've seen and heard and that have happened to this ummah that were very devastating and traumatic in many ways over the past few hundred years, nevertheless, our tradition is there. It's preserved, and it's accessible, maybe not as easily accessible in some ways as before, but nonetheless that is there. So I beseech myself and all of you to avail ourselves of that, to apprise ourselves of that, inshallah. So if we look at how we are to begin, and originally when we were talking about these set of classes or sessions, there was a request that we do it upon creed or aqidah. And I did not disagree with that notion, but I think we talked about in the previous two classes how the idea of creed or aqidah can be used in different ways. And traditionally in the books of aqidah or kalam or usul al-din, they talked about tools that were there to more or less dispel misconceptions about Islam. So our Muslim scholars early on realized that people brought their theological baggage when they came into Islam, and their different ideas about what divinity looks like, and what prophethood and messengerhood looks like, and what are the things of al-ghayb, what are the things out of the unseen world and what they look like, and how do they relate to one another, and so forth. And so these different questions came about that really weren't there in the beginning. But for our purposes, it's important to be acquainted with that, but at the same time, to use that as a point of embarkment, not to be mired in it. Yes, some specialists have to do that and have to know all the special terms and, is the name of God the same as God? Is the name of Allah the same as Allah? And these sorts of masail and issues that come up. And what is a jawhar and what is a arad? What is a substance and what is an attribute and how they relate to one another. And much of the Hellenistic frameworks were brought into Islam. They were synthesized into the ilm al-kalam, into the science of theology, but they were there for a specific purpose for a specific time. So we still need to know some of that, and hopefully I'm going to go through a little bit of it, but more importantly I'm going to focus on, practically speaking, what does that mean for our spirituality? How do we go about doing it? And I think one of the first things we need to talk about is to rectify, if need be, our way of looking at the world. Rectify, if need be, our way of determining, as I said, discerning reality from non-reality. Or in other words, discerning what is actually possible and what is not actually possible, and what is necessary and what is impossible. So Aristotle said that the main activities of the mind, as we said, are tasdiqat wa tasawwurat wa tasdiqat, which is conceptualizing things and then determining if given a statement, if that statement is true or not true. So how the concepts that we put together, if we put them together in a meaning, like a meaningful sentence, can we determine its truth or not determine its truth? How can we determine the validity of a truth claim of any specific statement? And that's one of the activities of the mind, right? So if I said, that man is 6'2" tall, and well, you need to know what a man is, and you need to know what the measurement is, the height, what's 6 feet or what's 1 foot, and what are inches. And then from there you can determine if that's a true statement or not a true statement. Or you can kind of eyeball it and then figure out how much truth you want to give to it. So these activities of the intellect are quite important, and they seem actually self-evident, and generally they are self-evident. However, there's kind of a lot of manipulation going around and different definitions of what's a rational idea versus an irrational idea. So the three things that I want to focus on right now are these concepts of possibility, necessity, and impossibility. And your intellect has the ability to determine if, given any particular concept or statement, whether it can be possible or not possible or impossible. And this is important because when we talk about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His attributes, these things are going to be one of the basic things we need in order to understand that. So when we say something is possible, we mean something is conceptually possible. The fact that you can imagine it makes it possible. So is it possible that I can have a lion in my room here as I'm talking to you, and he's chained back there, and he looks like he's hungry, we'll have to feed him? Is that possible? Possible, you won't believe it, but if you can imagine it, right, if you can imagine it, then that means it's possible, conceptually possible. But if I were to say, I'm actually sitting here right here in my study room, and at the same time, I'm also physically sitting wherever you're sitting, in your living room, or wherever it might be, at the same time, me, the physical entity, is in both places at once, you would say that's impossible. Because the same entity cannot occupy two spaces at the same time. I can either be here or I can be there, but I can't be in both places. And then what is there is a surah, right, is an image on the Zoom screen that you have in front of you, or something like that, but it's not actually the person. So the actual person, the entity, can only be in one place at one time. And the actual entity, the person, if it's a physical body, can only occupy the space that it's occupying right now, and it cannot occupy another space simultaneously. So that's kind of one of the laws of non-contradiction, like two things cannot be true at the same time. So I can't be here and I can't be there at the same time. The part will never be greater than the whole. by definition. Right? You have like a whole of something and break off a piece of it. Well, this piece that's there, is it ever bigger than the whole thing that it began with? That's impossible. And so this is the definition of rationality. So we don't say, well, it's completely irrational to think that there are angels that we can't see. And I would say, why is that irrational? Well, because we can't see them, so how do we know that they're there? Then our response to that would be, just because we can't see them doesn't mean that they're not there. So, عدم الوجدان لا يدل على عدم الوجود, as they say. So عدم الوجدان means my inability to sense them by my physical senses does not mean that they're not there. That's not a sound logical argument. Because I could not be aware of someone standing behind me, right? And they could be standing behind me. That doesn't mean that they're not there. It just means I didn't see them. So your inability to see it or to perceive it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. And this is very important because it requires a bit of imagination. You know, I always tell people, you need a little bit of imagination to really worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Not imagine something true, but you have to put yourself in a place where your senses are not going to help you, where it's beyond the sensory perception. So when the Prophet ﷺ told Jibreel about ihsan, ta'bud Allah ka'annaka tara, to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as if you see Him. So this kaf at-tashbih, as they say in Arabic, this like, as if, tashbih means try to imagine, right? It's a simile. It's not actually, you're not actually seeing Him. You're not going to see Him with your physical eyes, but you will be worshiping Him as if you could actually see Him with your physical eyes. So that means you have to imagine, if I could actually see Allah, right? And then the second part of that hadith, and I'm aware that He sees me, how would that reflect upon my actions? How would that reflect upon my everyday? How would that reflect upon how I speak to people, or how I act towards people, or how I drive, or how I treat my family, or how I treat my friends, or how I treat my colleagues, and so forth. So that's the ibadah, right? That some of them called ubudiyya. So ibadah is actually doing the acts of worship and other things. Amma al-ubudiyya is the state that one is in. So what the Prophet ﷺ was describing was a modality. He didn't mention a specific act of worship. He mentioned that with Islam, right? He's talked about Islam, and he talked about testification of faith, and prayer, and fasting, and zakah, and hajj. And when he talked about iman, he talked about the things that we know are true, even though we can't see them. But when he talked about ihsan, right, which is, again, a modality, how do you do things with ihsan? How do you do things with excellence? Then he said, use your imagination a little bit. Ta'bud Allah ka'annaka tara. So we have to be able to imagine that, right? And some of the techniques that we use even in prayer, imagine the Kaaba is right in front of you when you say Allahu Akbar. Imagine when you put your hands up like this and you have the back of your hand this way, that everything of the dunya and everything that is distracting you, you throw it behind you. Every single act that we do, both physical and the things that we say in every act of worship, has a significant spiritual meaning behind it, whether we can discern it or not. So Allahu Akbar, right? And why do they say Allahu Akbar? So that you say Allahu Akbar while you're moving your hands, right? You don't say Allahu Akbar, which is incorrect. It's valid, but it's not the best way to do it. Allahu Akbar. You say it the whole time as coinciding with the beginning of the movement towards the end of the movement, because there's significance of the two together, of what you are saying and what you are doing. And then that directly reflects on the particular state that you're in as you are doing it. So you have the words, you have the movement, and you have the hal, the state. That's all three. There's nothing left after that. That's who you are. At any one moment in time, that's all what you're about. You could be saying something, you could be doing something, or you could be thinking about something, or having, that state of what it is that you're thinking about. And so every aspect of the deen works in that way. Every aspect. There are asrar, there are secrets to even what we think to be the most trivial movement, moving your finger like this in the prayer. There's a significance to it, right? The ruku', obviously, and the prostration, and so forth, the zakah, right? Zakah is not, the purpose is not so that you remove wealth from yourself, but it's to remove stinginess. So it's a spiritual state that is trying to address, right? To zakki amwalak, right? To purify your wealth, and it's actually purifying yourself by removing the hal, the state of, or the vice of stinginess, of not wanting to part with what you think is your money. But it's actually not your money. Allah gave it to you as a trust. So you're a trustee over it. And so the one who has granted it to you is asking you to give some of it, a small amount, because you are the trustee over it. So it's really a gift to be able to do that. And then it also will affect your spiritual state. And we can talk about all of the different ibadat like that. We can talk about fasting, and we can talk about even the mu'amalat, how financial transactions work. We can definitely talk about marriage and divorce. So within what seem to be kind of just the basic rules and legal rulings behind everything that we do, and when we study it from a fiqh perspective, we think, is it obligatory, or is it sunnah, or is it permissible, or is it disliked, or is it forbidden or haram? That's from the outside view. And that's what fiqh is concerned with assigning rulings to these things, so we know whether to do it or what not to do it. But it does not address, we said this I think the first session, it does not address what you actually do, how do you go about doing it, right? And what should you be feeling when you are doing it? What are the meanings that may come? So you can read about these meanings, or if you are sincere, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can put meanings in you and understandings for you that He may not have given to others before you. وَمَا ذَلِكَ عَلَى اللَّهِ بِعَزِيزٍ. This is not difficult for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But we take it back to these very basic building blocks of training our thoughts, right? Training the way that we think. They throw this word around a lot, critical thinking, which basically means today, anything that you inherited from thinkers before you, just throw that out and think for yourself. Or that's my understanding of it. But that's not how we understand critical thinking. Critical thinking is the one that you have to be most critical of and accusatory of, is your own thoughts, is yourself, not other people's thoughts. These are thoughts that have been vetted, that have been studied by many, many people before us for centuries, if not more than that. So they're less apt to be wrong than your own thoughts, right? Because your own thoughts are not only new, but they're also affected by other stuff that's going on inside of you, right? Your desires, your whims, your caprice, your ego, your desire to be praised. Maybe you have misgivings about something in your past, could have been something traumatic, something that was hurtful, and it affects the way that you see things now. So these are all things that are going to affect how you see things and your discernment of reality. So from my perspective, it's better to put our trust in thoughts that have been vetted, that have been studied, that have been safeguarded, that have been vouchsafed for centuries, and then presented to us. Doesn't mean we have to accept all of them, right? If they're words and thoughts of people like us, but if they are authoritative in their own right, based upon understanding of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala seeks from us, and then there's a majority or a plethora of people who are saying the same thing, then this is one of the things we consider to be a trusted source. This is what we consider to be an authoritative source. And we don't have to go about figuring out the deen all by ourselves. Right? We need indicators, we need people to help us, we need people to show us the way, certainly, and then once we find our way, then we ourselves can take it from there. But to kind of just trust all the things that come to mind for us without being able even to discern the sources of my own thoughts. This is a discipline in Islam. Ilm al-Khawatir. To be able to discern where your thoughts are coming from. Whether it comes from shaitan, whether it comes from your ego, your nafs, whether it comes from the angels, the guardian angels around you who seek to help you, or whether it comes directly as inspiration from God, from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then there are signs to look for, right? And there's, a way of training yourself and of using certain acts of remembrance and dhikr by which you can help to discern these thoughts. So the true Arif Billah may not be able to completely remove all of the whisperings of the ego or of Satan, but what they can do is identify them when they do happen. Right? Like the shaitan came to Junayd, Sayyid al-Ta'ifa as they say, Junayd al-Baghdadi, and he told him, oh, I think in your wudu you missed your arm or something, or you missed a spot. And that's what shaitan does. He likes the waswasa. He likes to get people in their tahara, in their wudu and things like that, and tell them you didn't do it right. Then they just get mired in doing it over and over again. And Junayd said, no, I actually did wipe my head or I washed my arm, and you're a shaitan, you're la'een, and get out. Right, get out of my head, because I know that didn't happen. He was able to discern where that particular thought came from. Or when they said, Sayyid Abdul Qadir Jilani, when he was, wanted to just be free of everything, and he was leaving Baghdad, and he didn't like what he's found in people, and in the manner that they were frivolous, and the manner that they were not being very pious. So he went to the gates of the city, and he's going on his way out, and he's on his way, and then he sees like what he thought to be a vision, and it said, Ya Abdul Qadir Jailani, you have reached the pinnacle of ma'rifah and knowledge, and you need not burden yourself with what everyone else burdens themselves with now, like the takalif, like the sharia. He said, A'udhu billah, that can't be right. That has to be from shaitan. That's not a pure thought, because the Shia certainly is always going to apply to me. No matter what particular elevation or maqam I'm going to reach, that's always going to apply to me. So he turned back, and then he heard another voice that was pure that told him, your maqam is with them, is with teaching the people, is with being the people, not being by yourself. So these are the arifun. These are the people that we look up to who trained themselves in this way, in this regimen and spiritual rigor, and these are the things that they came to. And people talk a lot about karamat and flying in the air and walking on water. Most of the karamat of this ummah, of the ummah of Muhammad ﷺ, are spiritual and meaningful, not physical. Previous was different. The 300, the Ashab al-Kahf, the young men who fell asleep in the cave for 309 years, that was a very physical type of karama, because they weren't prophets, but they were siddiq, right? They were true and they're pure of heart, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave them that miracle and relieved them of living on the auspices of that difficult society that they were in. But most of the karamat of the ummah of Muhammad ﷺ are meaningful and spiritual in nature. Being able to discern your thoughts, for example, that's a karama, right? That's a type of saintly miracle. Being able to consistently pray 5 times a day and not miss a prayer. And people have done that for decades. Literally, people alive today who have prayed for decades in the mosque without missing a single prayer. That's a type of karama. That's why they say akbar karama al-istiqama. Al-istiqamatu akbar karama. That to be mustaqim, to be on the sirat al-mustaqim, to be mutiya, to be obedient to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this is the biggest karama. This is the biggest type of saintly miracle. So they can come in the form of realizations and the thimar, and the fruits of it will come outwardly in terms of people's character, in terms of their benevolence, in terms of their gentleness, in terms of their ability to absorb even people who are hurt and damaged and bring them to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Those are karamat, right? Those are incredible things. And we have our Muslim scholars and awliya and others who are doing that every day. They're doing that for people every day and as we speak. So this ummah is a weighty ummah, it's a beautiful ummah, and it has a lot to offer. And within the tradition of the ummah, we have a lot to offer and a lot that we can learn from, inshallah. So, again, I digressed a little bit, and our hour is just about over. We're going to leave time for question and answer. So I think I will I will stop here. And the next time we'll begin and talk a little bit about Ma'rifah and a little about Allah and His attributes, and then the divine names and how we relate to that to spirituality. And then from there we will go into some of the hikam, which are the wisdom sayings of Ibn Ata al-Sakandari that you saw described in the course blurb, inshallah. So, barakallahu fikum, jazakumullah khair. أسعد الله أوقاتكم وبارك الله في أولادكم وفي بيوتكم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.